this is going to be a bit shorter than it usually is, I think, because we're just doing the second half of canonicity on the New Testament, since we took the entire time in the Old Testament last time, which is nice because we can go a bit slower and I can put in a bit more details that I usually don't have the time to. And that's really great when we're talking about the New Testament, because that's where you get a lot of the controversy. All these people talking about, books, these secret books that were kicked out of the Bible. They're always talking about New Testament stuff. No one really gets into big, debates on the Apocrypha. But on what are called like the Gnostic Gospels and things like that, which, they're trying to claim should be part of the New Testament. That's where you get all the debate. So we can have a bit more time to talk about exactly what that entails, maybe than usual. Now, obviously, the writing in the New Testament was fairly different than the Old Testament. Old Testament took at least 1,000 years to write, maybe more. The New Testament was written in a matter of decades.
Was that because they were more educated?
No, there was just, the way I've always thought of it is that the Old Testament is just like everything that's sort of leading up, and then Jesus comes, right, and now you have everything. So it's just a matter of now of getting it all written down. And that was more or less the motivation, probably, for at least writing the Gospels, was to get it all written down. Because the Gospels weren't written until several decades after Jesus was ascended. Not because they didn't have the information, but because you didn't need it. At that time, you still had the apostles wandering around and teaching, and you had that sort of living history. And it was only when they started to die off that you really felt a need to get it all written down, so that you wouldn't just be passing it on and on and on in oral tradition. You could have the teachings of the apostles in a permanent form. And of course, during that period, you also have Paul writing his epistles, which were just letters. I mean, they were letters to different churches on different matters. So not only is the writing of the New Testament much shorter than the Old, but it's sort of a fundamentally different thing. They're books being written in a different form for a different purpose. So you have all the Gospels, all the writings in the New Testament finished by the end of the first century. And it does look like at least the 4 Gospels were kind of in circulation as a collection early in the 2nd century. And in fact, we'll talk about that next week when we look at manuscripts. And, we still have, fragments of what appear to have been basically the 4 Gospels collected into a single volume that would have been passed around. So that was happening probably by the beginning of the 2nd century. We have references to 4 Gospels by that point. They're not given by name, but they're, talked about as a group by then. But there doesn't seem to have been a real drive to pull a Christian canon together until probably the mid-2nd century, because until then, the in general attitude of the early church was that Jesus was coming back any second now. And you can even see that in Paul's letters. There seems to be this sense of Jesus is coming back any time. So there wasn't a real need at the time that they saw to really have a collection, like an official canon, because from their point of view, Jesus was coming back any time now, and he would set up his kingdom, and we wouldn't need any of this anymore. But, by the beginning and mid-2nd century, people were beginning to realize that, it might be a while before Jesus came back. And so there was a need to actually collect these writings, to have a list of inspired, authoritative works that the church could point to and say, this is what we believe, basically. And so you really have discussion over what books to be included from about the mid-2nd century to about the mid-4th. And by about the mid-4th century, it was pretty well set. But it took a couple hundred years for all, the discussions to die down. Now, when I say that, that doesn't mean that every book was discussed equally. Things like the 4 Gospels, a lot of Paul's letters, those were accepted automatically. There was never any question. The discussion almost always centered around sort of a few not secondary, but books that are sort of on the edge. Books like 2 Peter and Jude and, things like that. There wasn't really ever any debate in the early church about the legitimacy of the 4 Gospels and most of Paul's letters and of Acts. Now, you talk to, skeptics, people like Bart Ehrman and Dan Brown and those type of people, and they'll say that, for one thing, they used to say that the Gospels themselves were all written late, that they were written centuries after Jesus was born, and they're nothing but legendary. No reasonable scholar can hold that view anymore. And we'll talk about this more next week when we look at manuscripts. But there is hard evidence that all of the Gospels are first century. I mean, no reputable scholar even attempts to hold a late dating for the Gospels anymore. And late meaning 2nd century or afterwards. But the skeptics still will claim that the Gospels were written anonymously, that they weren't signed or anything like that. And
so even though there's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, they are saying they weren't necessarily written by those
yes.
guys.
And because, the Gospels don't begin with something like, say, I, Matthew, am now writing this sort of thing. So a popular skeptical claim will be that the Gospels were purely anonymously, that they weren't written by the people that we associate them with, and that they were written by people of a specific faction of the church that was trying to take control, so they put together their own Gospels to try to sort of make their doctrines the official doctrines. It's essentially that the New Testament as we have it today and the Gospels especially are just sort of a 2nd and 3rd century power play. That's the postmodern skeptical view. That very much that sort of conspiratorial, idea that it's all a plot. It's this plot by people.
We think we've got problems today. They had their own, didn't they?
Oh, yeah.
As far as, who's doing what and is this authentic
yeah.
or whatever.
And that was, and it's true that there were a lot of what are called pseudepigraphal Gospels. Gospels that were essentially written and assigned names by people who didn't write them. Like there's a Gospel of Peter, and there's a Gospel of Mary, and there's a Gospel of Judas, and we'll talk about those in a bit. So it's not like that didn't happen. But the early church knew that sort of thing happened, and they weren't blindly accepting any book. But certainly the skeptical view is that the claim of the Gospels themselves to be eyewitness accounts and the general Christian belief that they were written early, the skeptical view would be, that's not the case, that they're forgeries, that they're all just frauds, basically. However, the text itself, again, in quite a few places claims to be eyewitness accounts. Luke especially makes a point of opening his gospel by saying that he has interviewed eyewitnesses, that he has researched, and that he has put a lot of effort into making sure that his account is accurate. Then you have the Gospel of John, which is clearly meant to be an eyewitness account, because it's always talking about the beloved gospel. Jesus said this to the beloved disciple, and the beloved disciple did that. And then at the end of the gospel it says, and this was the disciple that, we're recording his account, basically. So the Gospels clearly claim to be eyewitness accounts. And while, Luke again claims to have written from eyewitness accounts. Also, so there's textual evidence in the documents themselves that would that assure us of their authenticity. Also, we have no evidence that the Gospels were anonymous. That's an assumption. But every manuscript we have of a Gospel, that includes the beginning, has that title, has the same title that we have for them today. So we don't have, for example, a copy of the Gospel of John that says it's really the Gospel of Lazarus, for example. Every copy we have that includes the beginning where you would have a title has the titles that we have today. So there does not appear to have been any debate in the early church that the Gospels were written by these people. And so this idea that the Gospels are anonymous is, again, it's an assumption you come across almost universally, even among Christian scholars. But there's no reason to believe that's the case. And there were other prominent Roman historians, Tacitus, for example, one of the greatest of the Roman historians, who did not sign his work. His name would be in the title of the work, but not in the text itself. But no one's trying to claim that Tacitus's works are anonymous and not really by him. And again, we have, very, very early attestation from the church fathers that these Gospels are written by the people they claim they were written by, and there was never really any debate on them. And the same thing goes for a lot of Paul's epistles. Obviously, Paul's epistles are not anonymous. Many skeptical scholars will claim that a lot of Paul's epistles are forged. They weren't written by Paul. They were just signed with his name to give them authority. But even the really skeptical ones, there's about 7 of Paul's epistles. I think it's like 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians. I don't remember all of them, but even the most skeptical will agree that, yes, these are actually from Paul. So we have a good chunk in the New Testament that the church has never really disputed. So,
when you look at the style of the writing of most of Paul's work, they're all in the same style.
Yeah, very much so. Now, you will get, skeptics pointing at what seem to us to be tiny differences to claim that Paul didn't really write that. But something you have to keep in mind, and this is something we'll talk about later, is that the standard back then, even if you knew how to read and write, which not everyone did, but even if you knew how to read and write, usually when you wrote an important document, you would use what was called an amanuensis, or a scribe. And the scribe wouldn't just take dictation. They would usually work with the author to help them polish their style and everything. And so differences in, word choice and that sort of thing can be attributed to different scribes, different people working with Paul. And we know Paul used some of those because they're talked about. You get to the end of some of Paul's letters and they'll say, this person wrote this and they're extending their greetings to the saints. And other times, Paul makes it a point of signing his own work with his own handwriting, which implies that the rest of the book was not written in Paul's handwriting. So, there's very little doubt that Paul used scribes. Probably Peter did too, especially in 2 Peter, because 2 Peter is very, very sophisticated Greek. But that can help account for what might seem to be some discrepancies in style. So we talked about why the church took a little bit of time to decide to try to figure out which books were inspired and which one weren't, because they still had the apostles in living memory. They were expecting Jesus to come back at any time. But, after that, we had in general what appears to be about 4 different motivations for deciding on a Christian canon, for deciding, what books are inspired and which ones aren't. First, they wanted an accurate preservation of Jesus' life and teachings. Since Christianity is historically based, it's much more important that we have an accurate representation of the life of Jesus than, say, a Buddhist would need an accurate representation of the life of Buddha, because they don't really care. To them, it's just about the ideas. But for us, the history is important. It really informs what we believe. So it was important for them to figure out what were accurate recountings of Jesus' life. And they had to sift through a lot because there were a lot of spurious gospels. And we'll talk about those in a bit. And some of those spurious gospels were just, legends that were probably written down and collected in good faith, but they just weren't accurate. And others were deliberate attempts at deception. The second would have been basically to complete the story of God's redemption, because the Jews already had their canon, so the early church had it as well. We talked about the Septuagint last time, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and that was the Bible of the early church. And so they knew that was the record of God's dealings with the people of Israel and with humanity, but that it wasn't complete. That you needed the story of Jesus to finish up the story. And so that would have been a motive for trying to collect a canon together. Thirdly, it was very important to preserve orthodoxy. And remember, orthodoxy, small o, doesn't refer to like Eastern Orthodox. It's simply a word meaning right belief. So orthodoxy is correct doctrine. So it was very important to preserve orthodoxy in the face of heresy. Again, especially in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, you had a lot of different heresies coming out. You had all these different ideas about who Jesus was, how he related to God, how he related to people, what was the nature of the Old Testament. So we had all these different heretical ideas, and they were almost always fringe. Again, a lot of these skeptics will try to claim that these heresies were like major competitors to what we would think of as genuine Christianity, and that it was just one branch of Christianity that managed to take over. But the evidence doesn't support that. The evidence appears to say that none of these heresies were ever more than like fringe movements. But there was still a real need to be able to defend against them. So Christians needed a list of inspired writings that they could point to and say, this is our authority. And if you disagree with this, then you're disagreeing with God. So very important to be able to preserve that correct doctrine in the face of heresy. Finally, you had to preserve orthodoxy in the face of persecution. Now, contrary to popular belief, the first 3 centuries of the early church, from Jesus to Constantine, was not just one big block of persecution for Christians. Persecution was usually local and sporadic. Now, Christianity was never legal, so persecution was always an option, but in most of the Roman Empire, most of the time, the attitude was very much live and let live. If the Christians aren't going to cause any trouble, we're not going to cause them any trouble. We don't really care. But occasionally you would get either some local governor or local prefect or the Roman emperor himself who got a bee in his bonnet about the Christians and wanted to take them out. Not so much in the 1st and 2nd centuries, oddly enough, but you see more and more of that starting in the 3rd. You had some really bad persecutions in the 3rd century, empire-wide, which most of the earlier persecutions were not empire-wide. And that culminated in the Emperor Diocletian, who actually was probably the worst persecutor of Christians throughout the history of the early church. And there have been some bad ones before. There was an emperor named Decius who was really bad about persecuting Christians. The emperor Marcus Aurelius, who is considered to be one of the good Roman emperors because he was a philosopher and all that, but he was a very harsh persecutor of the Christians. But the end of the 3rd century, you have Diocletian, almost certainly the harshest persecution of the church up until that time, empire-wide. And his goal wasn't just to kill Christians. He wanted to destroy all the Christian writings. because he knew as long as, Christian writings survived, the church would survive. So what he did, he would send his soldiers around to the houses of people who he believed were Christians, and basically he would say, "Give me your scriptures or I will kill you." And he would take them off and burn them. Now, so it was very important for the church then to know what actually was Scripture, because then, these early Christians could give these Roman soldiers Christian writings that weren't inspired, but, the Romans didn't know that. So they could say, "Oh, here are our books," and the Romans could take them and go burn them, but they could keep the actual New Testament secret and safe. So it was very important to know which books you needed to be willing to die for, basically. So for all four of these reasons, it became increasingly important for the Christians to figure out what books were Scripture, which ones weren't. So how do we decide that then? Well, there are basically three criteria for a book to be considered Scripture. There's sort of three questions you asked about a book. The first was apostolicity. In other words, the book had to have been written by an apostle or by a close associate, like a protege of the apostle. And that would mean that this book would carry apostolic authority. Because the apostles, the 12 plus Paul, had authority in the early church that no one else had. They had the authority that their teachings were considered equal with that of Jesus. Their teachings were inspired because Jesus had sent them out to teach the word. So the apostles had an authority in that no other church, no other Christian leaders did. So that was the first biggest criterion. A book to be considered inspired had to be written by an apostle or by someone with that apostolic authority. So you had, the 12 apostles, you had Paul, you had people like James and Jude who were brothers of Jesus and leaders in the early church. So they all had that authority. Now notice that this excluded any book that wasn't written in the first century. We don't know if any of the apostles survived into the second, even the early second century. We think they were probably all dead by then. So it didn't matter how good a book was or how popular it was. And there were some very, very popular books in the early church that were completely legitimate. They weren't heretical or anything like that, but they were known to be later. And there were people who, thought they might be Scripture, but it was eventually decided that they were simply too late to have been written by an apostle. So they weren't included. That would have been books like 1 Clement and the Shepherd of Hermas, the Epistle of Barnabas. We'll talk about some of that in a bit more detail maybe in a bit. And one thing to note about these non-apostolic works is that while they could be really good and they could contain lots of great biblical truth, they didn't offer new truth. It's like reading a really good book by someone like C.S. Lewis or Francis Schaeffer, or someone like that. They have lots of really great truth in them, but there's no new truth. They're just taking biblical truth and maybe expressing it in a new way that you hadn't thought of before, but it's still biblical truth. And that's what these, legitimate non-apostolic writings were doing. They were expressing biblical truth, but there's nothing new there. Now again, this wasn't a unified movement, and it wasn't an instantaneous thing. It was worked out over a couple of hundred years. So there were some non-apostolic works that were considered as scripture by some of the early Christians. In fact, some of the early manuscripts that we have of the New Testament contain books like First Clement and the Shepherd and things like that. But eventually they were all rejected. So that was the first criterion, is it had to come from an apostle or an associate, a protege of an apostle. Second criterion is orthodoxy. In other words, did the book conform to, quote, the rule of faith? Remember we talked about that last time. The rule of faith was the creed. It was the doctrines that Christians believed. So in order for a book to be considered scripture, it had to correspond to that rule of faith. There couldn't be anything in it that was obviously heretical. And you could tell that because, again, we had things like the Gospels, and they had Paul's writings and books where there was no debate on them whatsoever. So they could compare these other books to the books that had already been accepted. And if there's contradiction, then that gives you good reason to throw this other book out. Now, that doesn't mean everyone had to agree to the exact same thing. And obviously, there are books in the Bible that do appear to take different perspectives. I mean, look at, Paul's epistles versus James. They're focusing on very different things, but they're not contradictory. And obviously, this excluded books by people like the Gnostics that were obviously heretical. So a lot of these so-called lost books of the Bible or, secret books of the Bible were Gnostic. And they weren't included for the simple fact that they were obviously heretical, that they clearly contradicted the known teachings of Jesus and the apostles. Again, canonization, and we said this last time, was an attempt to get as close as possible to the earliest Christian belief. So you didn't want books that were sort of going off in a tangent or coming up with something new. You wanted books that were coming from that same tradition that Jesus and the apostles had established. The third criterion is Catholicity. Now, this doesn't mean that it was, what we would think of as Roman Catholic. The word Catholic means universal. And in fact, the church, by the 2nd century, was referring to itself as the Catholic, small c, church. Simply meaning that it was the universal church. It was the church of all believers. And to say that a book fit the criteria of Catholicity meant that it was accepted by a wide range of believers. That this book wasn't just accepted by the Romans, or wasn't just accepted by the Greeks, or by people in Alexandria. That there had to be widespread acceptance among the wide range of Christian groups for it to be considered for inclusion. And this was a strong criterion. For example, the books of Jude and Hebrews were among the most controversial. Jude, because it quotes from the Apocrypha in 2 different places, which was suspicious. And Hebrews, because even then they didn't know who wrote it. So they were very controversial, but they were eventually accepted because they had already gained widespread acceptance. So that argued for them being legitimate, that it seemed obvious that the Spirit had approved these books to the church as a whole. So there was a process that was gone through to decide which books were part of Scripture. It wasn't just a power play. It wasn't just one group trying to impose its beliefs on everyone else. This was a long, somewhat disorganized process, but nonetheless, was guided by some very strict rules. And this shows that the early church was fairly well unified. Now, you did have some rifts in the early church. You had, the Eastern churches had a bit of a different viewpoint than the Western churches, which had a bit of a different viewpoint than the African churches. But there was basic unity. And that's something, again, a lot of liberal skeptical scholars like to overemphasize and blow up out of proportion these rifts in the early church, acting like you had these completely contradictory Christianities, is what they call them. And that's simply not the case. There were surface differences, but underneath there did appear to be overall unity. And we have enough, manuscript evidence, enough historical evidence to show that the development of the New Testament canon happened gradually over a long period of time. And it wasn't something that came top down. It wasn't like there was some church council where you got like a bunch of bigwigs together and they said, okay, this is the Bible. It was very much bottom up. That the church as a whole, over time, basically figured it out. There was debate, there was, controversy back and forth, but over time, very organically, an idea of the genuine, divinely inspired books emerged out of it. And later on, it was officially recognized by, the higher-ups, but it doesn't appear to have been imposed by them. F.F. Bruce, in his book, The Canon of Scripture, which goes through all of this, history, he wrote this on this whole thing. He says, it was not until the 27 books had been generally accepted by Christians throughout the known world that they were first made the subject of a decree by an ecclesiastical council. The Synod of Hippo in 393. So the Synod of Hippo is when you had an official, sort of ruling that okay, this is the New Testament. But it had been unofficially decided long before that, again, just by the church at large. And when at last a church council gave a ruling on the matter, all that it did was to ratify the general consensus of Christians who, we may well believe, have been guided in this respect by a wisdom higher than their own. Canonicity implies supreme authority in matters of faith. They included these writings in the canon because they already recognized their authority. The writings did not acquire authority by being included in the canon. In other words, the church didn't decide which books were the Bible and that made them inspired. The church recognized the inspiration that was already there. And Bruce Metzger, another one of the great biblical scholars of the 20th century, put it this way: the canon is a list of authoritative books, not an authoritative list of books. So, again,
say that one.
Yeah. So the canon is a list of authoritative books, not an authoritative list of books. In other words, the books were already authoritative. They were authoritative, they were canonical the instant they were written because they were inspired. The church simply recognized that authority. The church didn't create it. Which is something you hear, from Catholic apologists when you try to bring up sola scriptura. Their response, and I've heard this from Catholic priests and they'll say things like, well, the Bible didn't make the church made the Bible. And that's not true. God made the Bible. All the church did was recognize that it came from God. But, that's how they get around, Then they can say, well, if the church made the Bible, then we have authority over the Bible and we could add to it and so on. So, So a lot of the way, at least that we know of, that these discussions went down is that different church leaders would come up with lists. By the end of the 2nd century, you were starting to see these different lists of inspired books from different leaders of the early church, basically just saying, well, these are the books that we use, that we read in our meetings. That's how they usually talked about it. These are the books that are to be read in our meetings. And they did that because they thought they were inspired. Again, the Gospels, most of the Pauline epistles, appeared to have been circulating together by the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century. So they were recognized very early on. Justin Martyr, a man who truly had no chance with a name like that. He was one of the great Christian intellectuals of the 2nd century. And he wrote that the Gospels were to be read in the Church of Rome, because that's where he was, by the middle of the 2nd century. So we knew that the Gospels were being read in the churches by then. Now, the first major list of, scripture books is found in what's called the Muratorian Fragment. That's Muratorian, the Muratorian Fragment. And the Muratorian Fragment is from the late 2nd century, and it's just a list of books that were being read as scripture in the Church of Rome. Not that Rome was special, it just happens to be what the list was talking about, and that's what we have. But it mentions all the New Testament books, except for Hebrews, James, and 1st and 2nd Peter. So they had already accepted all the others except for just those 4. But it also includes several of what we would call apocryphal books. And when we're talking about New Testament Apocrypha, again, that's different from Old Testament Jewish Apocrypha that we talked about last time. The New Testament Apocrypha would have been all these other books that were popular with the early church, but were eventually not realized as Scripture. And again, we'll talk about some of those in a bit more detail in a bit today. And this was fairly common. It seems that by the end of the 2nd century, most church leaders had recognized almost the entirety of what we would call the New Testament, but they usually also included some apocryphal works as well. So there was still, some working out that was to be done. The first scholar who appears to have accepted the entirety of what we would call the New Testament, so 27 books total, appears to be Origen, who was one of the great 2nd century Christian scholars. But it's interesting that he noted he accepted all 27 books. He noted 5 of them as being disputed in the church at large, though, and he listed those as being 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, James, and Jude. Interestingly, Origen is the first mention we have of the book of 2 Peter. There is no reference to 2 Peter in any Christian writing that we know of before Origen's time. And that's one of the reasons that 2 Peter is actually one of the last books to finally be accepted, because it appears to have been fairly obscure for about the first century and a half of the church's existence. No one knows why. It's also one that to this day, still gets a lot of attacks as to authenticity. Your typical biblical scholar will tell you that 2 Peter was not written by Peter. So it's still under a lot of attack, and it was one of the last books accepted. For some reason, it just does not seem to have gotten very wide circulation. Another list is called the Claremont list, Clermont, the Claremont list. It's another list of canonical works that was put together during the time of Diocletian's persecution. And again, this would have been mainly to let people know what books they could let the Romans take away and destroy, and what books they needed to keep hidden and defend. And it includes the entire New Testament, except for Philippians, Hebrews, and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And almost certainly Philippians and Thessalonians were left out by mistake, because there's never any record of any of those books ever being disputed. They're, as far as I know, they're accepted even by the most skeptical scholars today as being genuinely Pauline. So most likely those were left out by mistake. And again, Hebrews was one of those really controversial books because, again, no one knew who wrote it. And the Claremont list also included a few apocryphal books, but it put them in a separate section. So there was definitely a sense that these other works were probably not of the same quality as what we would think of as the actual New Testament. Good books to have, but not inspired. So, by the time of Constantine, by the time that Christianity was legalized in the Roman Empire, by the way, that's a common mistake. Constantine did not make Christianity the official religion. That was done several decades later by another emperor named Theodosius. All Constantine did, and he wasn't even the first one to do it, was simply declare Christianity legal. The emperor before him, who had a very, very short reign, had declared Christianity tolerable. He didn't say it was legal, but he also said that Christians should be tolerated. Constantine came along, made Christianity legal, and then about in the 380s, so about 50 years after Constantine, the Emperor Theodosius made Christianity the official religion. But by the time of Constantine, you already had, again, that core of the New Testament, that almost all of what we would think of as the New Testament appeared to have been accepted by virtually the entire church. Now, around 325, so about a decade or so after Christianity was made illegal, you had the great Christian historian Eusebius, probably the first historian of Christianity. And he was also trying to work out what books were inspired and which ones weren't. And he had sort of three different categories. The first category were called the homologumena. And you can...
I told you about using those words.
I'm just... It's Greek. They're all long.
It has to be.
But basically, these are the books that were universally accepted. Again, that was the core of the New Testament. By this point, about the only real disputes you had were things like Hebrews, some of James, 2 Peter, Jude. What we would really think of as mostly being kind of minor books, with the exception of Hebrews. Hebrews is pretty big. But, we could probably get along without having Jude in our Bibles if we had to. But on the whole, they pretty much had that worked out. The next category was what he called the antilegomia. And these were the disputed books. These were books like Hebrews and 2 Peter and Jude and Revelation. That was another big disputed one for probably obvious reasons.
Why was Jude so disputed?
Because he quotes from the Jewish Apocrypha twice. Okay. And he appears to be quoting it as Scripture. Books that nobody ever accepted as Scripture. So there was a lot of debate on Jude. So the antilegomia were the disputed books. Then finally had what he called the nothos, which were the spurious books, the books that were clearly not Scripture. So again, most of the New Testament books he considered to be homologumena, so completely accepted. The antilegomia, the disputed books, he had listed as James, 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, and Jude. And then the nothos, the spurious books were, again, these books that were popular but not Scripture. And these included books like 1 Clement. 1 Clement is the oldest non-scriptural Christian writing we have. And it's actually a letter by a man named Clement, who was an elder, a bishop in the Church of Rome, written probably around 95 AD. And it's a letter he wrote to, I believe, the church in Corinth, but I might be wrong about that. Just, apparently, once again, they were having problems. And so he was writing to, sort of tell them what they needed to do. It was very popular in the early church. There are several early manuscripts that include it as part of Scripture. It includes very large quotations from the Old Testament. I haven't gone through and worked it out, but I'll wager at least a third of 1 Clement is just quoting the Old Testament. He also quotes some apocryphal books like Tobit and some others. So it's a perfectly good book. It's well worth reading. There are some things in that you'll read and be like, oh, thank goodness we didn't think that was in the Bible. For instance, he refers to the phoenix. The mythological phoenix that would, burn in the... he thought it was a real thing. So it's one of the things you're like, well, that we dodged a bullet with that one. So it's almost surprising. I guess it really was just God making sure that it wasn't included because it fit all the other criteria. Clement was a close associate of Paul's. In fact, Paul mentions him in at least one of his letters. It's a very orthodox book. It was very widely read and accepted. So it really kind of fit all the criteria. It really was just the Spirit of God telling the church, no, this doesn't belong in the end. So that would have been one of his spurious books. Another one would have been books like The Shepherd, sometimes called The Shepherd of Hermas because it was written by a man named Hermas. Also, this was 2nd century. The Shepherd of Hermas is an apocalyptic work, somewhat like Revelation. It's not nearly as exciting as Revelation. In fact, it's rather long and confusing and weird. And there are some statements in it that could be interpreted as promoting what's called adoptionism. This idea that Jesus wasn't born the Son of God, that God adopted him as his son at his baptism. So that was that was an early heresy. There are some parts you might interpret that way, you might not. So it was popular enough that I doubt that most people would have interpreted it that way. But it was really popular. It was, on the top tier of books that Christians would read in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. But in the end, they knew it was written too late to be apostolic, so it wasn't included. So Eusebius put it in his spurious books listed, but it was, again, very popular. Another one, another spurious book that was very popular was called the Epistle of Barnabas. Now, it's called the Epistle of Barnabas, almost certainly not written by the biblical Barnabas. So this is one of those pseudo-apocryphal books, or is, a better known name was signed to it to make it popular. And it was written in the early 2nd century, probably. And it was written at the time when the Christians were really starting to distinguish themselves from the Jews. Because, for most of the 1st century, Christianity was just seen as a Jewish sect. And by the end of the 1st, beginning of the 2nd century, Christians were really starting to see themselves as separate. And there are several reasons for that. One, because by this point, the church was vastly more Gentile than it was Jewish. Also, the church had been treated so poorly by the Jews that there was a lot of resentment built up. And so the Christians were really trying to distinguish themselves, split themselves off. And the Epistle of Barnabas is basically in support of that. It's a book about the superiority of the New Covenant over the Old. And there's nothing in it that's heretical, but there are some very, very weird ideas in it. For one, he takes a very allegorical approach to the Old Testament and the Mosaic Law. And, he's saying things like, when God told the Jews not to eat pigs, he didn't mean it literally. He told them he didn't want them to associate with men of piggish habits, that sort of thing. And there are some other things he said which are weirder and funnier, but also somewhat dirtier that I won't repeat here. Again, if you want to read it, it's easy to find online. But again, it was well known to the early church that this was not written by the actual Barnabas, even though it was a very popular book. So it was spurious. Probably the other really big one is a book called the Didache, or sometimes known as the Teaching of the 12 Apostles. And to me, the Didache is the most interesting of these sort of extra-biblical books, because it's almost like there's some debate as to whether it was intended to be like a church manual or whether it was written as a way of sort of something you give a new Christian to kind of get them up to speed. But it does things like describe a church meeting. You know, in our meetings, this is what we do. And this is why we do it. And here are some of our basic beliefs. And it was probably also written at least partly by the end of the first century. So there are parts of it that might actually go back to the apostles. And what we have at the Didache, we don't have the whole thing. And we don't have a full manuscript. And there is a part in the middle that's just missing. So the best version we have, you know, it leaves off at one point and then picks up at another. And the part where it picks up appears completely different. So it's possible that what we call the Didache today is actually a few documents sort of shoved together. But nonetheless, it's a really interesting read if you're interested in just how did the first century church operate.
You spell the name of that one.
Didache, D-I-C-H-E, if I remember correctly. You can, and it's also called the Teachings of the 12 Apostles. But
that was easier to write down than
So those are some of the books that, by this point, Eusebius was considering spurious, but still very orthodox, very popular among the early church, just not Scripture. Then you have sort of another category, and you could call this sort of early Christian fiction. And you had things like, you had books like the Acts of Peter and the Acts of Paul and Thecla. In fact, every single one of the apostles, including people like Matthias, had an Acts book, where that was supposedly a record of their travels, spreading the gospel and all the amazing things they did and that sort of stuff. These would have been collected over time. In fact, they probably wouldn't have even achieved their final form until after Eusebius' time. But a lot of the legends were there already. And these books really were just collections of legends about the different apostles. There probably is a historical core to a lot of them, but they're almost certainly not historical. For instance, you have, the Acts of Thomas, supposedly, and it records how he goes to India and he gets in trouble with a king there because he convinces his wife not to sleep with them because it's better to be celibate. And, so there are just lots of weird stories like that. Then you have, accounts in the Gospel of Peter, or is it the Acts of Peter? One of them, that's an account of the resurrection, but in this version of the resurrection, Jesus doesn't just get up and leave. Rather, Jesus gets up, the stone gets sort of tossed out, and there's this great voice from heaven calling down to him, and Jesus gets up and walks out of the tomb, and behind him, coming out of the tomb, is this giant 30-foot cross that talks. And that's weird. Yeah. So like I said, there's nothing heretical in these books, but they're clearly legendary. They're clearly stories that have been embellished over time. So some of them can be useful historically. For example, Sean McDowell, in his book, The Fate of the Apostles, where he goes through and tries to trace exactly what the probability was that each apostle died as a martyr and like that. He treats them as probably having some historical core to them, but they're, but still being mostly mythological. And that's probably a good attitude to take. There's some truth in there. The apostles, Thomas, as far as we can tell, probably did go to India but he probably didn't get killed by some king because he told his wife not to sleep with him.
But you shouldn't have to tell your wife that. That's strange in itself.
Now, so these are Eusebius's 3 categories. And then outside of that, there were heretical writings that he didn't even include in his list of spurious books because he had so little respect to them. And these are almost all the Gnostic Gospels and the Gnostic writings. And this is where you get into all the modern day conspiracy theories and controversies. Because, all these, you have these Gnostic books like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Truth and the Gospel of Judas and the Proto-Evangelium of James. You have all these things. And they just get weirder from there. And they were books that were written 2nd, 3rd century, so way after the time of Jesus. Never, ever in any way accepted by the church. But they're very much pushed by modern day skeptics as being the secret lost books of the Bible that, teaches Jesus' real teachings, but that were thrown out of the Bible by this conspiracy, by the Orthodox group to maintain power. And again, almost all of these are in some way or another Gnostic. And the Gnostics were a group that kind of grew out of some aspects of Greek philosophy. In fact, there were Gnostics that never claimed to be Christian at all, but there were Gnostics that sort of saw the rising popularity of Christianity and tried to sort of co-opt that for themselves. And their belief, and it gets weird, and there are a bunch of different Gnostic groups, and they didn't all believe the same thing. But basically what they believed was that the God of the Old Testament was not really God. That he was a being called the demiurge. And that he had rebelled against the real God and as an act of rebellion had created this world of matter. So, the God of the Old Testament was this demiurge, and the demiurge was evil, and he was vengeful, and, he had trapped humanity in these physical bodies that were also evil. And their belief was that only the spiritual was good, that anything made of matter was inherently evil. And so the good God had sent Jesus to give this secret knowledge to some of his favored disciples that would allow them to transcend their physical bodies and become pure spirit.
Sounds like good science fiction.
Yeah. Well, in fact, it actually inspired some science fiction. One of the biggest science fiction writers of the 20th century was a man named Philip K. Dick. He wrote, books that they make movies out of his books all the time, like, Blade Runner and Total Recall and all these other movies. But he was really inspired by Gnosticism, and a lot of his books have a really strong Gnostic bent to them. But this kind of philosophy, this idea that matter was evil, only the spirit was good, and that you could you could leave your physical form and become pure spirit by having this secret knowledge, this gnosis. Gnosis, Gnosos, is just the Greek word for knowledge. So if you had this special secret knowledge that Jesus supposedly taught only his most trusted disciples, then you could get rid of your physical body and go join the good God. So the Gnostics were a group, again, that grew out of Greek philosophy, but sort of co-opted some Christian elements in an attempt to basically kind of ride the Christian coattails, because the Christian church was becoming quite popular in the 2nd century. Even though it was illegal, it was gaining a lot of followers. Now, the Gnostics were never particularly a large group. Despite what, these skeptics will say, they'll try to claim the Gnostics were these, there were just as many Gnostic Christians as there were, quote, Orthodox Christians. But as far as we can tell, they were never any more than a fringe. They did gain a few of the early church fathers sort of went over to their side, but not many. But they did produce all these writings, books like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Judas that attempted to portray Jesus as this Gnostic philosopher. And a lot of these skeptical anti-Christian scholars have kind of latched onto those, especially the Gospel of Thomas. They love the Gospel of Thomas. And they try to promote it as being the true Christianity. But these were books that Eusebius didn't even consider worthy of consideration. He's like, these are so obviously wrong, I'm not going to include them. But, you have people like Dan Brown and stuff, and if trying to portray these as being the true Christianity, and if people who don't know any better, will just believe it. Then you have sort of another group of books that were also never considered as legitimate, but were, again, sort of popular Christian fiction that were called the infancy Gospels. And these were, like stories that people made up about Jesus as a kid. Literally. They're infancy Gospels. They're the best known of which is probably also the infancy Gospel of Thomas. No relation to the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas. But it was very popular. Popular enough that portions of it got absorbed into the Quran, interestingly. But it has stories about how when Jesus was a kid, he made this bird. He was just playing in the mud, and he made a bird out of clay, and then he turned it into a living bird. And then supposedly some kid actually accidentally bumped Jesus in the street, so Jesus struck him dead. And the kid's father comes crying to Joseph saying, "Your son killed my son." And so Joseph says, "Well, Jesus, you better bring that kid back to life again." So he does.
Sounds like Sheldon in his young years.
Yeah, it's Jesus, the early years.
And we really thought that people didn't have anything else to do today to make up all these things.
Yeah.
It sounds very much like
It sounds like good reading for fun,
And again, I'm not convinced that even the writers were trying to do any more than just tell a good story. I don't know if anyone ever treated these as legitimate, except apparently for Muhammad, who heard them and incorporated some of these into the Quran. But he clearly didn't know what he was talking about. Anyway. So these are all the sort of different books that were floating out there. All of which eventually, even the ones that were under consideration, which would have been things like First Clement and the Shepherd and the Epistle of Barnabas and the like, they eventually were all rejected simply because they were too late. They were for the most part written too late to have come from the apostles. So by the time of Eusebius, you pretty much had it nailed down except for a few of these disputed books. And you had some debate over these last few books throughout the rest of the 3rd century. Finally, you have the Synod of Laodicea, which was in AD 363. So this is after Constantine's time, which finally sort of rubber stamped it as being, okay, this is the Old and New Testament. And they included every book that we would include in the New Testament except for Revelation. Because, again, Revelation was another one of these big disputed books, I think, for obvious reasons. But in 367, so just a few years after this, Athanasius, who was another one of the great early Christian thinkers, he was the Bishop of Alexandria. He wrote a lot. He wrote several very good apologetic works. He wrote a letter where he outlined the entire Old and New Testament, and he is the first example we know of that included everything we would consider to be the Bible and nothing that we wouldn't consider. And it wasn't, and basically he's kind of had the last word. By that point, everyone had sort of accepted it, and there wasn't a whole lot of dispute over the contents of the New Testament after that. So by the end of the 3rd century, so about 300 years after the writings were done, we finally had a good consensus on what the New Testament actually was. And this, at the Athanasius' list, was finally confirmed by the Council of Rome in 382, which was called by Damasus I. And Damasus was the Bishop of Rome. He was the first one you could possibly call a pope, because he was the first one that really sort of lobbied and gained that kind of power. He really believed that as the Bishop of Rome, he should be in charge of the entire church. And he was the first one to really gain that kind of power. So he called a council, and they, finally confirmed officially the list of the Old and New Testament. And then the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate, followed that same list, and that pretty well fixed it as well. Now, interestingly, there's never been a time where every single group that calls itself Christian has had the same New Testament canon. There are various, Eastern Orthodox and other obscure sects that still accept some additional books or reject some books. But the vast majority of Christians, ever since really the end of the 3rd century, have accepted the same basic New Testament. For instance, the Greek Orthodox Church doesn't accept Revelation. But you really didn't have a lot of debate throughout the medieval period until you get to the Reformation. Because, of course, once you get to the Revelation, everything's up in the air again. Because you have people thinking, well, the church, the Catholic Church, has been lying to us for 1,000 years. We have to question everything now. Especially since the Reformation was all about sola scriptura. It was all about the primary authority of Scripture, that Scripture was what you had to go back to, that anything that contradicted Scripture had to be rejected. So it was very important then that the Reformers know which books actually composed the New Testament. If Scripture is going to be your judge, then you have to know what is Scripture. Now, the medieval church had actually accepted Paul as the author of Hebrews, and the Apostle John as the writer of Revelation, which is something that there's always been some debate about. But shortly, even before the time of Martin Luther, Erasmus, who was another one of the great Christian scholars of his day, was one of the first great church thinkers that actually disputed that Paul wrote Hebrews and that John wrote Revelation. So there was already some questions starting to creep in again. And there were some other Catholic officials then that agreed with him, and some of them even challenged James, 2nd and 3rd John, and Jude again. So these questions were starting to come up. Though, none of them, even saying that their authorship might not have been what they thought, they weren't disputing the canonicity. They weren't saying that these books weren't Scripture. They were just saying that maybe these books weren't written by who we thought they were written by. And that's something there's still a lot of debate on today. Most people, I think, nowadays will say that Paul did not write Hebrews. When I was growing up, you still heard, well, who wrote Hebrews? Paul did. Now, most Bibles will not say that Paul wrote Hebrews. Most, Christian scholars will, at the very most, won't commit to it. And there's a lot of debate as to who wrote Revelation. Is John the Elder the same as John the Apostle? That's a big debate.
We know John, but we don't know
which John. Yeah. Because and is it the John that wrote the gospel? Is it the John that was first, second, and third John? Are those the same John? There's a lot of questions there. Because the style of Greek is very different between all of those books. But now you have Martin Luther come along. And again, Martin Luther is now sort of throwing everything up in the air. He's saying, I'm not willing to accept the Catholic Church's word on things. I need to figure this out for myself. And again, I need to figure it out from the authority of Scripture, which obviously is what we should be doing. But Luther actually questioned the canonicity of Hebrews, James, Jude, and Revelation. I'm not quite sure why Hebrews, Jude, and Jude. He never liked Revelation because he could never understand it. And he didn't like James for what would probably be obvious reasons. If James at first glance appears to uphold salvation by works. Now it doesn't, but if you don't really look at it and read it and study it, it's going to look like it does. So, for a long time, he didn't accept James as being part of the Bible. He did eventually. But when he made his German translation, he put those 4 books in what he called the outer canon. So he sort of had them in like parentheses. Though eventually he did accept all of them. But at first he was really questioning it. William Tyndale, who is, the great translator, and probably in a lot of ways the best man of the Revelation. He didn't have a lot of the baggage that these other people had. But he also followed Luther's lead in sort of setting those books aside and putting them in kind of a separate category. As not as they're not scripture, but as, these might be questionable, we don't know, kind of thing. John Calvin doubted Hebrews and 2 Peter. He didn't have a problem with their theology, he just wasn't sure who wrote them. But that kind of questioning of the canon seemed to be confined to sort of the early Reformation, people like Luther and Tyndale and Calvin. After that, once the Reformation really, had become a much larger movement, there wasn't a whole lot more questioning. People pretty much accepted the New Testament as it had been for over 1,000 years. Though, you'll still find people questioning, books like 2 Peter, for example, or 2 Timothy. That's one of those books the skeptics really like to attack. They claim that Paul didn't write 2 Timothy. And again, 2 Peter shows up so late in the writings of the early church that there has always been questions about 2 Peter as to whether or not it was legitimate. Just because we would have expected to have seen it mentioned before, it was. But for the most part, after that really early Reformation, things sort of went back to the way they were in terms of the New Testament. Now, the Old Testament, there was the whole Apocrypha issue. But for the New, after those first few, first bit of questioning and sort of considering, the church, the Protestant church, more or less fully accepted those books again. And so there really hasn't been a whole lot of debate in evangelical, conservative Christian circles about the Bible since then. Obviously you get to the liberals, the skeptics, and all that, and it's a different story. Questions?
Come on, Byron.
Barn.
Well, we're Barnes head.
All right. Well, recommended reading.
Let me ask a question.
Oh no, I definitely want you to ask a question.
When people talk about 2 Peter or the debate over 2 Peter, it's strictly what you're talking about. It's the historical, the time it was written.
Yeah. Well, and it's the question of, did Peter actually write it? Was it actually written in the first century, or is it a much later writing that someone just put the name of Peter on?
2 Timothy?
2 Timothy, the skeptics will say that Paul didn't write it, that it's a forgery.
Okay, Revelation.
Revelation is weird. And again, there's questions to who wrote it. But, I mean, Revelation is has faced a lot of opposition over time just because there are people who just think it doesn't belong in the Bible, that it's just too strange, that they don't know what it's saying, and that they just don't think it belongs.
Do you have strong thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I have my own ideas about Revelation that probably aren't the same as most people in this room. I take a more historicist view of Revelation than what you would call a futurist view. Basically, that Revelation, when it was written, was in the future, but it was about the entirety of the church age. So most of it's been fulfilled by now. There's still some stuff to come, as opposed to what's usually referred to as a futurist view, which is say that the entirety of Revelation is about the very end times. And there are some other viewpoints. There's what's called the preterist view that says Revelation was fulfilled mostly in AD 70 with the destruction of the temple. And then there's what's referred to often as the idealist view, which is what Calvinists and Presbyterians usually hold. And that is that the book of Revelation isn't about any one thing in particular. It's just about the struggle between good and evil, that it's very symbolic. So those are sort of the four views. In fact, if I'd bring it if I knew we were going to talk about it, there's a book called Four Views on Revelation, I think, or Revelation, Four Views, something like that. But what it is, it's a commentary on Revelation that includes each of those four viewpoints. They'll have like a passage of Revelation, and then they'll have four columns underneath it, and there's a commentary from each one of those viewpoints as to what that passage means. So it's really good if you just want to get an idea. And all of these are legitimate Christian interpretations. None of these four views are heretical.
Okay.
But they're just, these are different ways that Christians have interpreted Revelation.
It just seems that the context of the book, the premises, etc., are just so different than the rest of the details.
And again, there were questions over authorship, who actually wrote it. So, and again, Peter, because we have no mention of 2 Peter until the middle of the 2nd century. And there were people who questioned it then, has led to, a fair amount of debate over whether it's legitimate, whether Peter actually wrote it, whether it's a much later writing that was just forged, etc.
So are these scholars questioning all three, if it's biblical, if it's the writer, and if it's inspired?
Different ones are going to question different things. Some of them are just questioning who wrote it. Like Revelation, was it written by John the Apostle? Was it written by John the Elder? Are those the same person? Yes. Are they not? Others are going to take something like 2 Peter and say, Peter didn't write it. It's a forgery. It's not inspired. It shouldn't be in Scripture. But again, most of the ones who are going to say that are going to be skeptical scholars to begin with. So they're not going to say it's not inspired because they're not going to say any of it's inspired. But they're going to say it's a late forgery.
So maybe, is it a situation where 2 Peter could have been written?
Yeah, I mean,
in a similar time to 1 Peter, but was lost.
Yeah, and that that's sort of a common explanation is that it was written around the same time, but it just didn't get wide circulation for some reason. Maybe it wasn't seen to apply to the church as a whole or something. And again, there's also an issue that the Greek of 2 Peter is very different than the Greek of 1 Peter. And how much can you attribute that to a scribe or could a fisherman have written this book, basically? So again, but pretty much any conservative Christian is going to accept that these books are Scripture. And there's good reason to believe that all the Pauline epistles are written by Paul, and that the 1st and 2nd Peter are written by Peter. And if for another reason, then the early church would not have accepted it otherwise. As they were, despite the way that these skeptics try to portray them as being these dumb yokels who just take anything, there was a lot of debate. They were very strict. They were top-notch scholars themselves. and they went over these books with a fine-tooth comb. So there's good reason to trust that God led them to the proper books.
Yeah, because they were probably out to prove something, being a scholar themselves, they were probably out to prove something for themselves, of themselves.
Yeah.
Just having that, I know more than you know.
Yeah. Anything else? So, recommended reading, we have this one, The Canon of Scripture by F.F. Bruce, that basically just goes through the whole history. How was the Old Testament canon decided? How was the New Testament canon decided? And this is sort of the, definitive work on it. So it's not a hard read. It looks like small type, but it's not a hard read. Next we have this, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses by Richard Baucom. This is one of the best books written on who were the authors of the Gospels, basically. And it's incredibly well done. It's a landmark work. And he goes through, makes a very, very strong case that the Gospels were all eyewitness accounts. Interestingly, he does not believe that the beloved disciple was John. He believes that John the Elder and John the Apostle were two different people. And he gives reasons for believing that. Again, not to say that it's not Scripture. It's just, what John are we talking about? He also, in this book, this is where he put forth one of the best evidences for the dating of the Gospels that have come about in the last, 10, 20 years, where he goes through and looks at the names in the Gospels, the names of all the people, and compares them to other lists the scholars have put out as to what names were popular among Jews in first century Palestine and how popular they were, because first century Palestinian Jews had very different names than, say, Jews in Alexandria. Oddly enough, there was just, in the same way that, yes, we speak the same, the UK and us speak English, but there are definite, English names and American names and same sort of thing there. He goes through and shows how the frequency of names in the Gospels exactly matches the frequency of names that scholars have determined for first century Palestine. And that even explains, why some people have these extra names. Like you had Simon, but we also call him Peter. So you have Simon Peter. Well, why did they do that?
So confusing.
Yeah. Well, you do that because Simon was the most common name. You have Simon the Pharisee, you have Simon the Zealot, you have Simon of Cyrene, you have Simon Peter, and you had to have that because half the people you met were named Simon. So you had to keep them straight. But it's those things that if the Gospels had not been written by eyewitnesses, if they hadn't been written by first century Palestinian Jews, those details would not be in there. And it wasn't like they sat down and the people were writing and thinking, okay, how do we make this, how do we put in good evidence? It was just they wrote down what they saw and heard, and so naturally the truth lines up with the facts of the period. And so that's just a small part of it, but that part got a lot of attention because no one had thought to look at that before. And it's just some great evidence for the Gospels. But it really is an excellent, excellent work. And lastly, Darrell Bock's book on the missing Gospels. So if you want to read about the Gnostic Gospels in detail.
I'll take that one.
Okay.
I already passed that other one on to Barbara. And she's going to put it in the library.
Okay, yes.
The other one was, I did finish it, but it was hard for me.
Yeah.
That was a hard book for me, though.
Which one was it?
Resurrection of Jesus. What was it? I don't remember the name.
Oh, not the big thick one, but
right,
the
the thinner one.
Yeah.
It was just for me. My brain was just hard for me to follow.
Mm-hmm.
So some of it I kind of comprehended, and some of it I kind of didn't.
Yeah, but that one just goes through and talks about all those Gnostic works, and just goes through and says, okay, this is what was in them. This is what it was saying. This is why they weren't accepted. So it's it's interesting. And then
that caught my interest because in my mind it's like that is just. I was not joking when I said that's a good science fiction movie.
Yeah, and it is, and you get some great weird ideas from them.
Yeah.
And then recommended viewing, I again have 3 YouTube videos here. These are all from Mike Winger's Evidence for the Bible series again. Mike Winger.
Those,
it's on there, honey.
I've glanced at a couple of those. He is very interesting, the way he speaks and everything.
Yeah. But the entire Evidence for the Bible series is really good. But, these are the ones that pertain specifically to what we were talking about today and last time.